So good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure today to have here Professor Ndez. Ndez is a professor of history at UC Davis. He focuses on European exploration and colonization of the Americas, the US and Mexico, transatlantic, now moving on to the Pacific Ocean as well. He wrote a book, like an epic book, on Cabeza de Vaca. We're going to discuss today the book, The Other Slavery. He won several prizes. He's working on a book about conquering the Pacific. I want to point to this amazing piece of historiography. I mean, it's a midway between academic and the general public, which is the most difficult thing to do. He brings in history, but also ethnography, geopolitics, questioning of myth, reconceptualization. It's an amazing contribution of history. And as a colleague of yours at UC Davis and Rese said, Daniel Stolzenberg, you also tell a very good story. So welcome to the Conversatory on Racism.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here. And thank you, Mara, for this very wonderful and undeserved introduction.
So let's start by the title of the book. Why the Other Slavery? It definitely elicits comparisons, right, with what we understand as the slavery. And these are things that we have been discussing in the Conversatory, Black slavery.
Sure. Well, so yeah, of course, the title is a play on that other form of bondage that we have chosen to ignore for a long time. It seems when I started out this project, I imagined that it would be a pretty constrained project centering around the 16th century. But as I kept collecting information about the enslavement of Native Americans in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and all the way into the 20th century, I realized that this is a parallel system that never went away and that we are not very much aware of. So that's how the project began. And I would say in terms of the title, it is other, not just because it's a kind of bondage system that targets Native Americans as opposed to Africans, but perhaps more profoundly, it's another form of slavery in the sense that it was only shortly deemed legal, and then it was made illegal. And yet, by the time it was made illegal in the middle of the 16th century, the use of coerced native labor in the Americas was very entrenched, and that was the only way to sustain the colonial economy that developed in the continent. And so it became other in the sense that those who profited from it resorted to euphemisms or legal subterfuges in order to get around the prohibition against Indian slavery, but continued in other ways. So it is other more fundamentally in the sense that it went underground and it became deeply entrenched and deeply difficult to eradicate because of that.
So that's a good point. You were suggesting that, in I think it was 1542, that the Spanish crown actually prohibited slavery. So that makes it very difficult historiographically, right, to track this slavery. So I would like if you can elaborate to how you came to numbers. I know you did an amazing, work in periodization to get to these numbers. And also, what was the conceptual framework to actually count these numbers as the other slavery?
Absolutely. Mara, you touch on all the difficult points about this project. So first of all, when I started this project, I realized that giving numbers was going to be absolutely essential. Because if you look at African slavery, we derived a lot of sense of the importance of these phenomenon, or of this tragic phenomenon, because of the sheer numbers. We know that 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. We know that it was a transatlantic phenomenon that spanned, civil war in Angola, or maroon communities in Brazil or auction houses in South Carolina. All of this is part of the same transatlantic world. I wanted to do the same thing for for Indian slavery, and yet the problem of the sources was immediate. African slavery was legal, as we were saying, from the beginning until it was not legal centuries later, in the middle of the 19th century. And as a result of that, we have plenty of sources to document this institution. African slaves show up in bills of sale, in wills, etc. And moreover, because they had to cross an ocean, we have very abundant port records, and they were counted along the way. So we have very good records about the numbers, the destinations, the origins, etc. In fact, there's an incredible website, Slave Voyages, that some of you may be familiar with, which really is the most comprehensive data set of everything we know about these 12.5 million victims of the trade, the transatlantic trade. In the case of Indian slavery, it was far more complicated because they were both procured and consumed, so to speak, regionally or locally. We don't have port records. And it was legal only at the beginning, only in the first decades, from contact all the way to 1542, as you say, with the new laws. Even during that early time, it was kind of discouraged, but tolerated in certain circumstances. So very early on, again, that was one of the surprises of this whole project, is that the Spanish crown turned out to be a very steadfast supporter, or rather opponent, of Indian slavery, yet it happened in spite of these efforts. So early on, the Spanish crown prohibited Indian slavery, except in a few exceptions. So for example, Indians who were cannibalistic could be legally enslaved, or Indians who had been ransomed, that is, purchased from other Indians who already had taken them as slaves. That was also legal. And however, what appears just a couple of exceptions turned into a major business. And so the only way to do that was to completely eliminate all these loopholes, as the Spanish crown did with the new laws of 1542. And so yet it continued. So I had to be creative. I knew that I needed a number, and the number that I finally came up to is 2.5 to 5 million people from 1492 all the way to 1900, when it declined significantly, the institution declined significantly. I tried to do that by region and by 50-year period intervals.
In 4 centuries, right?
In 4 centuries, 400 years, yeah, worth of information. We can talk about the numbers. I can go on and on about the numbers, but the question is, I could have come up with much higher numbers based on a few contemporary statements by people who commented on these. But I always try to be very judicious, if anything. And of course, it's a preliminary. I could spend a whole lifetime trying to come up with the most exact number, which no single individual could do. But we needed at least a baseline, and people can, those who follow up on this research, can criticize my estimates, increase them or decrease them or criticize them altogether. But we needed a baseline. And so that's what I tried to provide with this book. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please.
Well, I said that in order to even begin counting them, I had to wrestle with the most daunting problem of all of this that you raised, which is I needed to know who counts as an Indian slave.
Was my next question, yes.
Yeah, so I had to come up with a definitional problem, which was one that completely defined this project from the very beginning. What do I mean by an Indian slave? Who counts as an Indian slave? And the honest answer is that there were many variable systems of bondage to which Native Americans were subjected. So I cannot come up with a unified single definition because it took so many different shapes. It changed over time and it changed from region to region. And we can talk about some of these different kaleidoscopic ways in which Indian slavery occurred. But even though I could not come up with a precise definition, I could come up with four general characteristics that typified all of these different formats or forms of Indian bondage. And so I can briefly mention them as we go, and it's worth keeping in mind as we go through this discussion. So one of them is that normally these type of bondage systems required Indians to be forcibly transported from their place of origin to a very distant place. And the reason for that is very clear. If you, as an owner, were preying on a native group that was close to where you lived, you open yourself to retribution from these aggrieved Indian group. And so the result was to really forcibly transport these native slaves to vast distances. So that's one. A second characteristic, general characteristic of many of these institutions is that once they were in the place of work, Native Americans were unable to leave. Number three, there was the use of force, or at least the threat of the use of force to compel Native Americans to work. And number four, there was either no payment or symbolic payment. So in some of these institutions, for example, repartimientos, there was payment. And so some of my Latin American colonialist colleagues were saying, well, they are being paid, so therefore this is not slavery. But the payment was often in clothes or food rather than in metallic or money. And it was so low as to be symbolic. So it was clearly a way to, once again, get around the prohibition against Indian slavery. And so what I mean by symbolic is like it was very, very low compared to the market rates. And there were market rates. So that's sort of what I would say generally about the definitional problem. I can't quite define it in every single stage, but people themselves wrote that it was a slave-like kind of institution. So even though we may not recognize it in the 21st century, the people who suffer these institutions, they were clearly aware that they were being subjected to something slave-like.
And to come up with such a conceptualization requires such an amazing background work, because you have to go beyond the definitions and the given form and actually try to extrapolate the principles of each of the practice, right? What were the preconditions of each of the practices in order to establish, conceptual similarities, and then get to those four traits that you also point out in the book are with us till today, because those are exactly the traits that have to do, I'm jumping ahead, but with trafficking today, women, children, right, with forms of bondage that are happening today to 42 million people. So before jumping into that, you also mentioned that you are two things, like you're looking at the victims, in historical record. So can you tell us a little bit about, that look into the historical record, and particularly if you can just tell the story of Beatriz? I think it's a very illuminating story that you tell in your book.
Sure. So one of the things that I wanted to avoid when I started writing this book is it's so vast, as you mentioned. I'm covering 4 centuries over. It's a moving story that begins in the Caribbean, goes through central Mexico, then moves to the silver mines of northern Mexico, and ends up in what is now the American Southwest. And so by covering so much ground and so many years, I was fearful that I would end up reducing everything to some sociological generality. So I really wanted to get my hand on some real perspective from some of these native slaves. And I found it in the extravagant colonial legal Spanish legal system, which, as we were saying, Indians were deemed free and vassals of the king. So the king of Spain was the protector, and as a result of that, they were able to have access to the Spanish legal system um, to seek their freedom, which is basically what happened in the second half of the 16th century. So as many as like thousands, maybe over 2,000 Native Americans, mostly from the Caribbean and from the coast of Mexico and Central America, were shipped to Spain as slaves, and they toiled in households in all over the Iberian Peninsula until these new laws of 1542, and word got out in Spain that the Indians were actually free. And so these became amazing sources. So I was really jumping up and down when I went into the archives and saw that some of these court cases ran for hundreds of pages, 800 pages, 600 pages, 400 pages of testimony. Basically, what I was having is the closest thing to the voice, I mean, the voice of the natives themselves as plaintiffs. They often, in order to build up their case, they had to invite neighbors, or they had to invite other members of the household in order to support their testimonies, and all of that was recorded. I should also say a little bit about the courage involved in these 16th century courtroom dramas, which is that during the duration of the proceedings, these native slaves had to live with their masters, whom they were suing. And so you can imagine the enormous pressure, or the ways, the mechanisms, the tools available to the owners to try to get them to desist, or to try to spirit them away to rural properties in order for these proceedings to go away. So all of that just by way of describing the circumstance. So this is a case of so Beatriz, that you're mentioning, is a case of a multi-generational case that is very revealing about how the traffic worked. In fact, even though the majority, and we can talk about this in a separate, the 2/3 of the African slaves were adult males. In the case of Indian slavery, was exactly the reverse. It was mostly women and children. And this was very much the case in many of these Native Americans who were shipped to Spain. They had been taken when they were very young, taken to the ports of Iberia, to Seville, etc., and then they were sold there as slaves, pretty much in the very same, using the same legal documents that were used for African slaves. And so as a result, many of these individuals had been taken when they were 11, 12, 13, and therefore they no longer recalled many of the things from their homelands. They did not necessarily speak native languages. And so the courts, the case often hinged on whether or not they spoke native languages, because the law was so clear that it was against the law to hold Indian slaves from the Spanish colonies. Then all they needed to do was to prove that they were from the Spanish colonies in the New World, and then they would be set free. But the lawyers working for the owners used to try to exploit this lack of knowledge from these individuals who had been taken when they were very young. So they would ask them whether, they would try to play on their gullibility, asking them whether they were elephants in their homelands, or giraffes, or this plant or that plant, etc., clearly trying to demonstrate that they had come from Northern Africa or from the Portuguese Indies, as they were called, so the Portuguese possessions, and it was legal to keep slaves from the Portuguese colonies in the New World. So they were trying to prove that they were from Brazil or Suriname or someplace like that. So this is very much the case of Beatriz, who was the second generation. So her mother had tried to get out of to sue her master. She did not succeed, and and she died being a slave. And so Beatriz continued the fight in the second generation. She had multiple children with multiple parents there. And you know, if her mother couldn't prove that she was from the Spanish Indies, then her chances of being able to prove that she was from the Spanish Indies was even less than her mother. But these, and this is just one amongst dozens of such cases. It just shows the incredible determination of many of these Native Americans shipped across the world, and there's no reason to assume that the natives from the New World were less persistent in trying to seek their freedom than those who were shipped all the way to the Iberian Peninsula.
That's an amazing story, because for me, it just speaks of the complexities, right, of subjectivity and this agency to break bondage. But not only that, but also on the side of the Spanish crown, that this is a little bit, the mystifying, right? Because the Spanish crown actually provided like legal aid, we would say today, and interpreters, like culturally sensitive practices. And this is amazing. I mean, maybe you want to address the role of the Spanish crown in this and the discussions that happened during the Valladolid summit, right, between de las Casas and Sepúlveda.
Sure. I mean, I can. So the role of the crown is quite fascinating because, on the one hand, the Americas were a papal donation. So the power or the legality of Spain taking over all of these enormous lands and taking control of all these peoples in the New World hinged on their drive to actually Christianize and provide for the well-being of all of these peoples. On the other hand, the crown needed to make this into a profitable enterprise. And of course, Spanish settlers or conquistadors would go there with the expectation that they would use coerced Indian labor in order to improve their circumstances and become wealthy. So the crown tried to walk a fine line between these two contradicting impulses that it had. And so that's why initially it kind of prohibited Indian slavery, but there were a few exceptions where it was okay. Then, as you mentioned, in the run up to these laws, we have these remarkable friar, basically, but he was, so Las Casas is the best known, but he was hardly alone, of a set of reformers who in the face of the debacle of the Caribbean, I mean, the Caribbean was becoming completely empty of humans, and we normally think of, epidemics in which nobody had fault, but there was a lot of slaving went on, as many scholars have shown, and I discovered as well. So clearly they were reacting to that, and that persuaded the Spanish crown to take this more firm approach against Indian slavery. And it worked in some parts. It worked in the Iberian Peninsula, as we were saying. Actually, Indian slavery disappeared. This traffic that I talk about, of a few thousand people being sent in the early 16th century, became more rare in the second half of the 19th century and practically disappeared in the early 17th century. The New World was completely different. And what the record shows is the inability of the Spanish crown to actually enforce its own laws in the New World. Because here we had the interest of the interest of the colonists, who were very much in control of the crown apparatus, and they blocked any attempt to make good on the desire, the wishes of the Spanish crown, which again puts these absolutists. We tend to think of the Spanish crown as this absolutist, very powerful, corrupt crown, and in fact, we find a crown that is unable to enforce its own laws. Understandably so. I mean, they were ruling this entire hemisphere from halfway around the world. But that was not all. So I just wanted to finish your question, and I'm sorry that I'm rambling with later on in the 17th century, in the final years of the 17th century, um, there was clear reports about widespread slaving in the Spanish frontiers went to Madrid, and these reports alarm the king at the time, Philip IV, his wife, Queen Mariana, and their child, Philip II. I'm sorry, Charles II, the Bewitched. So they launched what I called an anti-slavery empire-wide crusade that raged all the way from northern Mexico and New Mexico, et cetera, to Chile, all the way to the Philippines, trying to get people to grant freedom to their Indian slaves. And once again, it shows the remarkable extent to which the Spanish crown, tried to liberate Indians. It also shows the extent, the limited power that they have to enforce these laws. And it also shows maybe something fundamental if we look forward into the future, which is even though these Spanish reformer kings and queens were well-intentioned, they always took one case at a time. They never came to conceptualize universal rights in the same way that they would be conceptualized a century later during the French and the American revolutions, et cetera. So the idea that these were human rights that applied to everybody at all times. In the case of the Spanish royals, they always, they generally discourage the practice, but they reserve the right to use Indian slavery as a punishment in extraordinary cases in which the Native Americans were so fierce, they were so barbaric, that only an extreme measure like slavery would be the appropriate way to deal with such people.
So that's a great point, because there were, like, I think, two figures that were kind of allowed by the Spanish crown. One, it was, cannibalistic people, and the others were like religious wars against, right, the crown and the church. But even those were very minimal. And actually what shows is like the force of these, in Spanish, you have this saying, echa la ley, echa la trampa, right? Like once the law is made, you find a way to get around the law, right? These subterfuges and this malleability of practices to get around. And that's the most difficult. And here is where we also can trace a parallel with what happened after the 13th or 14th Amendment in the US, and also after the American and the French Revolution, because forms of subjugation persisted, right? Can you tell us a bit about this adaptability and malleability and which forms it took in the specific case of Indian slavery, even illegal, sure, but slavery still?
Absolutely. So all along, as I said, from 1492 to 1542, 1492 to 1542, Indian slavery was discouraged, but it was possible in certain circumstances. After 1542, it became completely illegal in all cases. But new institutions, some of which had been used before, came to the fore. So one of them, for example, was Encomienda. So this comes from the Spanish verb encomendar, which means to entrust, as some of you know, I'm sure. And that was basically a grant of Indians given to a meritorious Spanish settler as a reward for his role in pacifying, that was the term, a particular region. And so these entrusted Indians, encomienda Indians, were not slaves in a technical sense, meaning that the encomendero, the Spanish overlord, did not own them. But he did have a right to obtain either produce or labor from them. And in return, he was in charge of their education, which normally the encomendero would subcontract with a friar. So that's the way it worked. So when you have an institution like that, that first of all, that encomienda, that whole encomienda setup um, is, I mean, this is one of the things that I struggled with this project, is that you really have to go, not take the Spanish terminology as a given. You need to understand why it's happening the way it's happening. And so this is clearly one way to get around the problem of not having outright slaves. Um, and it took different forms. This also gives you a sense of the complexity of the problem. So in central Mexico, for example, Indian encomiendas were not tantamount to slavery. They were tantamount to a tax, meaning Indian communities in central Mexico remain under the rulership of their own native lords. They had to surrender a portion of their crops to the encomendero, and that was it. So you can imagine that encomienda was like a sort of like a tax. But in northern Mexico, where you don't have sedentary agricultural communities, but rather nomadic or semi-nomadic groups that have nothing but their labor to give, then the situation was very different. Here, the encomendero was basically the person who had uh, come in contact with these peripatetic Indians first. He then went to claim them as his encomienda, and he would basically drag them at gunpoint or force them into his estate. Normally, he would have either agricultural estates or sometimes silver mines, etc. Force them to work, sometimes for just a period of time. For example, if it was an agricultural estate, it would be for planting and harvesting, and then he would release them again. The fact that these Native Americans were semi-nomadic doesn't mean that they were wandering all over the place and it would be difficult to find them. The encomenderos knew exactly where they were, because these indigenous groups followed very well-defined circuits meant to take advantage of the availability of certain food sources at certain parts of the year. So the encomendero knew exactly where to find these groups at any given point in the year. And so in a situation like that, the encomienda resembles more like a cyclical form of enslavement rather than an encomienda of central Mexico. So the very same word, encomienda, can take very different meanings depending on where it is in the Spanish world that we are talking about. Just to give you an example. So encomienda became a very important one. Repartimiento was another one, just to give you another example. When Indian slavery was no longer legal, a form of corvée labor, meaning, for example, silver miners would request from the Spanish crown a certain number of workers. And the way the Spanish crown would do it was to issue a law demanding that maybe 10% of the certain population of a town had to be going to these repartimiento, to these corvée labor projects. These were for mines, or they could also be for road maintenance or construction projects in the cities, etc. Theoretically, these repartimientos were very well regulated. So they could not exceed 2 months of the year. They could not exceed 10% of the population of a given town. They had to exclude certain groups of people, so children were not a part of it, etc. But the reality is that it was a grab of individuals, and it amounted to, again, cyclical forms of enslavement, indiscriminate enslavement from different communities that were relatively close to mines or roads or other public works, etc. But perhaps the most important of these alternative forms of slavery was peonage, something that will become very familiar in the United States as well later on. And that is the advancing of a loan of money to a potential worker. And once that loan had been accepted, then the only way to pay off that loan was through one's labor. But once that loan was accepted, that person could not leave the place of work. As we were saying, these characteristics that we looked could not. So this was very common very early in the colonial period, in the 16th century already. I was surprised. I thought this was more of a 19th century, a later phenomenon. But since the 16th century, we see that very clearly in what were known as obrajes. So these were textile workshops in which entire families, not just males, not just the person who contracted the loan, but the entire family was locked behind doors, forced to work, and and they were kept for years, paying off the loan. And of course, you would imagine that the clothing and the food expenses, etc., were added to the debt in such a way that it would be extremely difficult to get out of it. So later on in the 19th century, this became so eventually encomiendas were outlawed, repartimientos were outlawed, and so peonage became the predominant way of the other slavery, so to speak. And in places of northern Mexico, or in places like Texas, etc., or New Mexico, we find debts affecting entire families and being passed from father to child, from one generation to the other. So anyway, so it worked very much like an alternative to slavery.
So this is like the current form are the Manilas, right? The families working behind doors, for hours and hours without having to leave. But what strikes me when I read your book is that you're saying at the very beginning, everyone did slavery in one way or the other. The Dutch did it, the Portuguese did it, the Spanish did it, then the Mexican did it, then Americans in California did it. It was peonage, it was debt, it was leasing, it has shifting and morphing forms. Even Apaches did it. First they were enslaved, then they enslaved back, right? And it points to the difficulty of actually eradicating, this form in particular. And if you can speak to this, when it's so tied up with economics, right? Because the drive was, economics, and even the silver was economics related to China, but that was the drive, right? Not the fact that they were like different people or less because of being a different race. That was kind of the added layer of justification.
Right. Well, I mean, there are two things here. Yeah. So one of them is that this is really a story about the human condition. It's not a story of good people and bad people, because as you point out, everybody who was in a position to benefit from this institution did it. It happened before contact. These more culturally bound forms of slavery that existed prior to Colon in the Americas, to Columbus, prior to the Americas, became commodified immediately and expanded. And everybody, different Native American groups, as well as the Spanish, the Dutch, as you're saying, the Mexicans, the Americans did it. There are a few instances of Native American groups that didn't do it, but basically it's because of environmental or economic conditions that made it not a profitable enterprise. Meaning, additional slaves were also additional mouths to feed. And if you were in a situation in which food was scarce, then it didn't make sense to have slaves. But everybody else who could profit from this traffic did it. So in that sense, I remember once I was giving a talk, and they said, well, you call it the other slavery, but in some ways this is the slavery. I mean, the other slavery is really African slavery. That's really the weird one, in which everybody agreed to make it legal. And so that is the outlier. Then the norm throughout history and until now is a situation in which this is not okay, it is made illegal, but it happens de facto because people who profit from this find a way to work through the system in order to make it happen. So in that sense, I think the other slavery is a more appropriate precedent to the kinds of human trafficking that we see today rather than the normal Atlantic slavery that we think of, that is in some ways very unique. It has some very unique aspects tied up with the colonial history of the Atlantic world.
Here you leave me with a choice between two questions that are a segue to what you're saying, but in completely different directions. And so I'm going to ask both. One is, this also points to the complexities of identity, right? And how one's position in that system, prompts you to do things, even being oppressed yourself, and that's the story of a slaver that you tell in the book, Luis de Carvajal y Cuevas. If you can tell, that story. He was a Jew and then a crypto Jew, and he has a very important role in fostering slavery, and then he has like a very paradoxical or ironic downfall. And the other question, between the slavery and the anomaly, slavery, is that, if you can tell us more, after the 13th and 14th Amendment, as I pointed out before, what actually happened is that, of course, Black slavery was abolished, but it actually took the form, right, of these mutating, adapting practices that were taking place in the West, in California, for a long time, in order to keep on subjugating Blacks. So, I mean, I'm detouring here, but if you can say one and the other, otherwise I will forget.
I feel that I am rambling so much that I'm going to take the second one, and we can always come back to the first one. That's a very interesting story, but again, it unfolds it takes us back to the 16th century. So I want to move forward in time. So I'm going to take the 19th century that we haven't really talked too much about, if that's okay.
Sure.
So yes, so one of the fascinating things is the way in which the other slavery washed into what is now the United States. The interesting thing is that in the eastern coast of the United States, Indian slavery had existed in colonial times. There is excellent work about how the Carolinas, for example, were a crucial supplier of Indian slaves to the Caribbean islands. Or there is good work about how New Englanders, in the aftermath of all of various wars and Indian wars, shipped the vanquished Native Americans across the Caribbean as slaves. So that had existed in colonial times, but in the course of the 18th century, it was kind of phased out, and African slaves were brought in significant numbers. And so by the early 19th century, African slavery was thought of as the slavery, even though, and eclipsing completely this previous history of Indian enslavement. So that was in the eastern seaboard, but in the west of what is now the American Southwest, the institution of Indian slavery remained alive and well. And so it is very interesting to see some of these Easterners moving into places like New Mexico or California or Utah, and encountering this other slavery from this background of African slavery being the model. And so so that was very interesting to me, because some of these, so for example, I followed very closely the writings of the first Indian commissioner of the territory of New Mexico, who was a Southerner, a man from Georgia, who was very familiar, obviously, with African slavery there. His name is James Calhoun. He traveled first to Washington, D.C. before taking up his post as commissioner in New Mexico, to try to find out something about the tribes that existed in New Mexico. And then he arrived in New Mexico and found an incredible human geography. Basically, what you have in New Mexico is a Spanish set of settlements that had affixed themselves basically to the Pueblo Indians, who lived along the Rio Grande, and then surrounding them, there were four large groups or tribes, as he called them. So there were Comanches, there were Utes, there were Apaches, um, and there were Navajos. And so all of these human geography proved especially conducive to the enslavement of natives. So slaves were being traded back and forth. And so Calhoun actually interviewed some of these individuals. And he clearly, because of his background, his Southern background, he said, well, you know, they call them here peons, but it is what we understand in the Old South as slavery. So you have all these very interesting comparisons by some of these individuals. And so, and the story, the same thing goes for the Mormons in Utah and ranchers that went all the way to California, where you, in California, for example, California was a part of Mexico. So again, this is, there are lots of nitty gritty in all of this story. California and New Mexico were parts of Mexico up until the war between Mexico and the US. And that meant that African slavery had been prohibited since 1828 or 29, when Mexico abolished African slavery. So as a result of that, these American pioneers going into places like Texas and New Mexico could not, at least not legally, bring their African slaves. And so they very quickly adapted to the system that they found there and, you know, moved into having peons and using the peonage system excellently, as in the same way that the, you know, the Spanish speaking peoples of the region, and some, as well as some Native Americans, participated in this active traffic of humans in the region that had long existed that had existed for centuries. So so this is the setup that we have. And of course, it was extremely difficult to eradicate. So when Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, it tried to eliminate Indian slavery, and it failed. And the United States did the same thing with the Civil War. There was in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was a chance to eliminate these practices because the 13th Amendment, as you noted, not only abolished slavery, but also involuntary servitude. That was the term. And so opening the possibility of liberation to many of these Native Americans who had been held in bondage in the West. But what happened was basically that the court system, and the Supreme Court in particular, chose to interpret the 13th and the 14th Amendments that applying mostly or very narrowly to the African American population, and largely excluded Native Americans from this. So as you know, Indians who were not taxed were excluded from these protections, and they were not fully incorporated into the nation until the 1920s. So so the other slavery, in some ways, had because it had been invisible, illegal, it outlasted African slavery. And as you point out very well, Mara, in the Old South, in the Reconstruction South, many of the black codes that were enacted in the aftermath of the Civil War and the techniques used to re-enslave the liberated, the freed African Americans, in many ways resembled the methods of the other slavery. So vagrancy, for example, or convict leasing, all of these methods that had been long well known in the West were expanded at this time to the South. Now, I don't know whether there was a direct connection between the institutions of the West and the South. Scholars who have studied this tell me that these had existed in the South as well, maybe even before, in the 17th or 18th centuries, and similar practices had existed in the Caribbean. So, some of these institutions may have been imported from the Caribbean rather than from the West. But the point is, the larger point is that Western Native Americans would have found the codes to which the liberated African Americans were subjected during the Reconstruction very familiar indeed.
That's a fascinating point, because it brings this malleability of practices, but at the same time, it has to do with how, central powers, even though they are very intentional about abolishing certain practices, that happens with the Spanish crown, but also with the 13th and 14th Amendment, given the either like vast territory or decentralization. And it is the case, with the US, we discussed, I'm sure you're familiar with Ira Nelson, when affirmative action was white, right? That he, traces the difference between the federal power and how that was actually discretionally allocated locally. And that is part of the story of what you say happened in California in order to actually make that system of peonage persist, right?
Right. Well, I find it very fascinating that that peonage was also eventually outlawed. So there's an anti-peonage act in 1867, 66, 67, that made it illegal. That act, that anti-peonage act, was meant for New Mexico, where the practice was particularly notorious. And in fact, there were federal agents that sent reports back to Washington, D.C., and they said, well, this has to stop. This is tantamount to slavery, and we got to stop that. Well, that had a temporary chilling effect in New Mexico. But what's really interesting to me is that the peonage cases convicted under that Anti-Peonage Act of 1867 occurred in the South rather than in New Mexico, which already gives you a sense of how exactly what you're saying, which is that when those who profit from coerced labor find an avenue close to them, they move to a different pastures, they target a different population, they go to a different geography to continue their activities.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because we see how all these issues that we've been discussing in the Conversatory, also with John Powell, he talks about racing and not race in ways that you kind of move to mutating and adaptive practices to continue, subjugating people. And what you point in the book is that, it moves to different groups. I mean, that we need to keep in mind that once we abolish for one, it doesn't mean that the practice, and that conceptual extrapolation that we do is not going to, apply to other groups. And this is what takes us to contemporary forms of trafficking and subjugation that you point out, in the epilogue of your book. But I want to go to the beginning of your book, because we didn't touch, upon this issue, and this is a very trendy, unfortunately, issue, and it is the relationship between epidemics, right, and slavery. Because one of the myths is that, of course, Europeans came to the Caribbean and they brought epidemics, and this is how the native population die, which removes complete agency and wrongdoing on the side of, Columbus and the other conquistadores. But you point in the book that actually the first record of epidemics comes like 26 years, I think, later, when the population was already decimated. And there's a very important point about considering those people superfluous, right? That they're disposable, exactly what we're seeing today.
Right. I think that's a very perceptive and very topical comment. I think our experience with COVID-19 has made clear that epidemics don't just happen. They happen to they target in particular specific groups, especially badly. And so thinking of epidemics as just indiscriminate, everybody suffers the same, is not the way it actually works. And this is very much the case with the so-called virgin soil epidemics of the early colonial period. So I want to be clear that they were real. So meaning these were illnesses, pathogens that Native Americans, for which the Native Americans had no resistance. So this was a significant phenomenon. But the way in which it happened was very much having to do with human agency, as you point out. So I look at what happened in the island of Hispaniola, or Española, the large island shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic today, a very large island. And what I see is a large population. So some of the early sources give population in the millions, like Las Casas that you were referencing earlier on. He says that 2 or 3 million people. Well, that's completely outlandish. But maybe a much smaller population existed there, 1 to 2 to 300,000. And I've seen very recently, there have been DNA studies that suggest that it's even smaller than that, even smaller, maybe 50 or 60,000. But anyways, whatever the initial number, and we don't know the initial number because obviously we don't have records for that and we have to make some estimations. What we have are very good early Spanish censuses, because these were the Indians that were distributed in encomiendas, as we were saying. So they were apportioned. So the census takers were very careful about counting everybody. And so we have very good numbers. And what we see is a precipitous decline in the early years, immediately after Columbus. And the reason for that is, again, pretty obvious, because they discovered the largest gold mines in the Circumcaribbean there. And that was a business that required everybody to pitch in, and really grueling labor. And as a result of that, hunger also affected the island, because all the able-bodied individuals were dragooned into the mines. And so there was no people to plant. And so we have displacement, we have appropriation of indigenous women by the Spanish colonizers, and we have these grueling systems in the gold mines. So we have a precipitous decline of the population, and we don't have clear records of smallpox until after that. So we have excellent records for 1517, for example, that posit a population decline of upwards of 90% or even more of the population. Yet we don't see any reports of massive epidemics until a year after that. And this makes sense epidemiologically, because the voyage from Spain to the Caribbean at that time took about 4 weeks. And as you may know, well, first of all, smallpox had become endemic in the Iberian Peninsula, meaning this was the kind of thing that you suffered as a child, and you either survived and became immune for life, or you died, and that was it. So first of all, the likelihood of some mariners being infected with smallpox getting aboard one of those ships was small. But even if they had gotten aboard ill, this is the course of the illness runs about 2 weeks, at which time you either recover or you die. So they would have died along the way, and their bodies dumped in the ocean, as that was the practice. So the only way for smallpox to actually cross the Atlantic in the conditions of a 16th century vessel was by having an infected person and another subject who would contract the illness en route and would live long enough to disembark at the other end. So that was one. So the likelihood of this was minuscule. Maybe there's a demographer, Massimo Livi Bacci, who estimates the likelihood of this to 1 or 2%, perhaps, back of the envelope calculation. Alternatively, although smallpox no longer exists anywhere in the world, it has been eradicated, it is possible that some of the scabs falling off from an infected person would have contained viable virus that perhaps in bedding or clothing could have arrived in the New World and could have, given the right circumstances, infected a Native American and spread from there. So all of this obviously happened, but all of this explains why it didn't happen instantly. We tend to think of these epidemics as spreading like wildfire instantly, But that's not what we find in the record. What we find in the record is many instances of violence, of exploitation, of hunger, of displacement, of appropriation of women, that explain a lot of the initial decimation of the population, especially of the Caribbeans, the first few decades of the Spanish colonization. So yeah, very topical, very very relevant to what we are witnessing today.
It's very topical, and it's discouraging because 400 years later we are exactly at the same point, namely the exploitation, the appropriation, the hunger that makes visible through the epidemics, and then the epidemics is blamed for that when there's actually a human system, right? Yeah. That have, as you say, like a very synergistic relationship between the decimation and the epidemics, namely, today, the essential workers are those who have to work for economic reasons, that they're at the front, so they contract more likely the epidemic or the COVID and they die. And you have to replace that workforce. And what you do it with the most vulnerable, and so on and so forth. There are so many questions that I would ask you, Andres, but I have to be fair to our audience and ask them to submit questions via the Q&A, please, and not the chat, so we can start asking questions. And Andres, of course, and this is the prerogative of professors always, if there's something that you want to add that you deem important that I haven't covered, or the questions, please, I encourage you to do so. So the first question by Robert Tolan is, how far into North America did this slavery extend? And did you study slavery of Native Americans in Peru, Bolivia, Chile too? How is it different, or was it different from Caribbean and Central America?
No, that's a great question. Well, so let me say, Indian slavery occurred all over the hemisphere. I mean, from Alaska all the way to Chile, and in fact beyond, from the Canary Islands all the way to the Philippines, which were a colony of Spain during this time. And we find Filipinos and others being forcibly transported across the Pacific into the silver mines of northern Mexico. So it is a ubiquitous institution, and that is part of the problem. It is so vast. It is that when you look at any particular, so Indian slavery is not a secret, meaning every researcher who has done work in the colonial period or the 19th century in any particular patch of the Americas has found evidence of these human traffic. But, a couple of hundred natives enslaved here and there don't seem to amount to much. It is only when you put the whole thing together, these enormous territories, along with a 400-year history, is that you begin to realize just the scope of the entire. Did I go into? As I said, mostly my focus is on the Caribbean, Mexico, and the American Southwest. I believe that it would have been ill. I mean, doing a systematic work of Indian slavery of the entire continent would require 30 volumes or something like that I can't possibly do. I occasionally glimpse at other places. So for example, I was saying about the empire spearheaded anti-slavery crusade of the late 17th century by Philip IV and Queen Mariana. And there you get reports of the geography of slavery in the empire frontiers. And so there were large files for places like Argentina, Chile, the Philippines, northern Mexico, and the Caribbean. These were the most important ones. Peru is interesting because there it was regularized or systematized as the so-called mita, which is one of these subterfuges, and that was massive because they had the largest silver mines in the world for some time. But that remains to be. I mean, again, you can piece this story together from different books, different articles that talk about this, but no, my own work was a lot more constrained than that. But it did occur everywhere.
What I want to point out, I mean, before the next question, is that for you, the most important thing is like, this is why I chose the picture that I show, this kaleidoscopic, I can never pronounce it in English, form that all these practices take. So we need to step back and look at the whole picture in order to actually dimension, the real extent and pervasiveness of these practices, which makes it, really difficult to comprehend and apprehend. Let me go to, so Robert, you asked another question. We didn't refer to this. What was the difference between Spanish American slavery and Portuguese American slavery? And then Ellen Helford, what is your understanding of this slavery and the other slavery to the development of capitalism and imperialism? Well, we need a few hours to respond to that, but let's start.
Yes. Right. Indian slavery unfolded both under the Spanish Empire and under the Portuguese Empire. And in some places, we're talking about the same people. So there are, of course, boundaries between these two empires where people moved back and forth and experienced both types of slavery. Was there any great difference between the two? I don't think so, but I don't know. This is an area that would require more research. As I said, in the 16th century, clearly the Spanish had regulated and prohibited even more so than the Portuguese side. So that's why in these trials that we were referring to, it was enough for the lawyers on the part of the owners to prove that these natives in the Iberian Peninsula had come from Portugal, where it was entirely okay and legal to do this kind of thing, whereas it was not in the case of the Spanish. So there are some differences in timing, but as far as differences in the texture of the slavery, I don't know. That's an interesting question. I could say that there are interesting, and this is not a question that the ask, but I think it's relevant here, is that the Europeans did not invent Indian slavery. It had unfolded in the New World for thousands of years before Columbus came onto the scene. But the types of slavery that we find in pre-contact times were very culturally bounded. They unfolded in very particular ways. So, for example, everybody will know the way in which the Aztec Empire procured captives for human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism, for example, or the ways in which in the Iroquois Confederacy in the American Northeast waged so-called mourning wars, so wars to replace the dead by capturing a member of a neighboring group. Up here in the Pacific Northwest, elite marriages in pre-contact groups were sealed by a dowry, a sort of a dowry that included slaves as well. So all of these were cultural practices that have been well documented. But with the arrival of Europeans, what we find is a commodification of these practices. So it was so much easier to trade from one region to another. That's why we find, in addition to a commodification, an extension of these networks of enslavement. And so that's how it is possible now to find Apaches, for example, being traded all the way to Canada or all the way to Cuba, or Filipinos traded all the way to the silver mines of northern Mexico, or people from Mapuches from southern Chile transported all the way to the Peruvian mines. So anyway, so that's as far as the texture and how it changed with the arrival of Europeans. And then remind me, the second question was?
The second question, I have to read it again, but it was related to imperialism and capitalism.
Oh, yeah.
And when you talk, I mean, it in my mind, it sounds like there was a different idea of wealth, right? Between the pre-contact, as you put it, and, the coming of the European, and that may relate to the question that Ellen asked about
Yeah.
capitalism and imperialism.
Well, it's a vast question, but maybe I can at least take a small piece of that by saying that there is active research going on about African slavery, in the sense that to what extent African slavery helped in the development of the capitalistic system,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that the investment in African slaves was a pretty substantial one, and slaves uh, acted as a form of wealth, very much as a part of the capitalistic structure. So, for example, you could use your slaves as a collateral to get a loan in order to expand your operations, in the same way that you would use your house or your farm, etc., as a collateral. Or you would make investments in African slaves. And so the question then becomes, to what extent did Indian slavery serve the same function? And my answer, again, without going too deeply into it, is that probably to a far lesser extent than African slavery, for the reasons that we've already sketched out, meaning that it was generally prohibited and therefore irregular. The other slavery unfolded in a gray area. And to that extent, because of that uncertainty, it could not be used necessarily as a form of storing wealth. For example,
Mm-hmm.
as we mentioned for the case of the Iberian Peninsula, if you invested heavily in acquiring slaves in the second half of the 16th century, because of the liberation decree by the Spanish monarchy, all of a sudden you find yourself unable to resell these slaves in the market. If you were able to resell them, you had to resell them at a deep discount, or you were simply unable to do that because everybody knew that it was against the law and the crown frowned on these practices. So it did not serve the same purpose as African slavery, as an integral part of the development of the capitalistic system. But that's my initial take, without going too deeply into that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm going to cover the questions. I also want to encourage everyone to without the screen. This is the book, The Other Slavery. I'm sorry, without having like a green background. So Indiana Quadra is asking, during the U.S. Civil War, did the Confederates in places like New Mexico Territory or Southern California bring African slaves with them, and or extend the southern form of slavery into the Southwest territories, but appropriating native populations?
Hmm. Well, so I would answer two ways. First of all, we do have many instances of the two slaveries coming in contact with each other, if that's sort of the bottom line of the question.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, we have groups like Cherokees holding Indians as slaves. We have Indian slaves and African slaves working shoulder to shoulder in some of the silver mines that I studied in northern Mexico. So the two slavery, and in fact, the two slaveries interacted in very interesting ways. Because, for example, if let me just give you a couple of sentences on the silver mines in Parral, for example.
Mm-hmm.
African slaves were a lot more expensive. So a slave who knew how to work silver could be worth 600 pesos, etc., in the 17th century in one of these silver mines. Whereas an Indian slave could be worth anywhere between 60 and 120 pesos. So if you were an owner, a rational owner, a silver producer, you would, first of all, deploy your workforce in a way that made sense. So, for example, many African slaves would not be deployed in underground dangerous activities,
Mm-hmm.
because you would be jeopardizing your pretty considerable investment. Whereas Indian slaves were far more expendable that way. So the two things came in contact. As to your other question about the 19th century, what happened? So I think New Mexico offers an excellent and New Mexico and California offer excellent examples of how of the surprising ways in which we analyze things like that we think we know, like the Civil War, and give new meaning to that. So in the case of New Mexico, basically what happened is that early on in the Civil War, a group of Texas was a part of the Confederacy, as you know, and bless you, came
Thank
into
you.
New Mexico, came into New Mexico, um, seeking to occupy New Mexico and continue to the west. But then there was a unionist column formed here in California that essentially crossed Arizona, moved into into New Mexico, and was able to defeat and make the Texan forces retreat. And so here you have 10,000 troops from California deployed in New Mexico with nothing to do except to wait for the outcome of the Civil War elsewhere, further east. And so what these column, along with some other volunteers in New Mexico, decided to do was to, quote unquote, deal with the Indian problem in New Mexico. And so that's how they decided to wage a war on the Navajo Nation and to remove them from where they were in the Canyon de Chelly and move them to a reservation in what is now eastern New Mexico, the Bosque Redondo Reservation. So what you find is an incredibly disruptive war during the Civil War in New Mexico that essentially was being waged against the Navajos. And surprisingly, what we find, if you look at the baptismal records of New Mexico during the Civil War, what you find is an incredible spike of Navajos being baptized by New Mexican families, which can only be explained by Navajo children and women being taken in by New Mexican families as a result of this war and this forcible relocation, and being incorporated into Nuevo Mexicano families, as we know all too well. So again, you know, the Civil War acquires a very different flavor and meaning in the West, which bleeds into Indian wars that ultimately feed the fans of these other slavery.
Thank you, Andres. We have, wow, 5 more questions, and I'm going to just lump them in 2, because I would also like you to tell us something at the end about your new book. You're moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific, conquering the Pacific. So question from Malcolm Giesen. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I have invested in Canadian gold and silver companies with operations in Canada, Mexico, and South America. Every year I ask the CEO of these companies what they did for local communities. They provide me a list of the millions they spent on school, healthcare facilities, roads, and recreational facilities. And of course, their operations pay more than any other business in the area, and they employ hundreds of people. I have visited these operations in Mexico, Chile, and in Argentina, and spoke to local people. That has confirmed what the companies told me. Can I believe what I see and hear? So that's question number 1. And question number 2, Elaine Weinstein, what role or relationship did the church have to this slavery in North America?
Right. Okay, great questions. So the first one, so my research and my book deals centrally with the extraction of silver in the colonial period. So, there is plenty of documentation of the way in which that was done. So just to give you a sense, the way we talked about the gold mining that went into the Caribbean, that pales in comparison to the silver mining that went all over the New World. Because as you know, I'm sure, silver had to be followed the veins. This was not superficial digging as it was done with gold in the Caribbean. So there were some outcroppings of silver that had to be followed, usually very down. So some of the deepest man-made shafts in the world were silver mines in Mexico, in Guanajuato specifically. Um, Before the introduction of explosives, these had to be done by hand. And that was only the beginning of a very difficult process. These ore had to be brought up and they had to be crushed to a pulp, and it had to be mixed with various reactives, including mercury, which is very highly toxic. So we have documentation of how that was done. So for example, some of the workers called tenateros, because of the word tenatero comes from tenate, which is the fiber bag used by the workers who had to go down on ladders, and they had to prop this bag on their head with 50, 60, 70 pounds of ore in these bags. And they needed to have the hands free in order to climb the ladder to get the ore out before mixing it, crushing it and mixing it. There is very clear evidence that many of these workers were indebted and they could not leave the company. There was so all of that, and I even offer uh, a picture in the dating from an American mining engineer from 1904 in the Porphyrian era to documented the labor conditions, and they seem like straight out of the colonial period. So that's of course the colonial period and the early 20th century. As to how so I end my book in 1900 as to how these practices that I describe evolved in the 20th century, and how do we get to the the silver mining operations that we see today, or Canadian, etc. I don't know. This is something that I did not research, so I can't answer the question as to exactly how. But I can tell you that the background of this is very well documented, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can read a bunch of works on colonial mining, and they will all tell pretty similar stories. The second question.
I was going to say that that's a great point, and it made me think again, not less because I'm Argentine, but conceptually, about the point between the central and how that local practice is actually arranged, right, in terms of adaptability. But this is probably comes from distrust. Sorry, Andres, you were going to address the second question,
which I've forgotten promptly. What was the second question?
It was about the role of the
the
relationship.
Church.
Yeah, the church.
Yeah. Well, that's a fascinating one. The church, if you go back to the 15th century, the church was very much involved in the justification for African slavery, right? So the Portuguese in the 1440s were dealing with some Western Africans, and they asked the Pope whether it was okay to enslave these peoples that were unbelievers and actually enemies of Christianity. And the Pope went along with that, and it was okay at the time. So the church early on served to justify the practice of African slavery. But in 1537, it came against Indian slavery. It continued to support African slavery, but it came in against Indian slavery. So at least in principle, that was the position of the church, even though we know that at the local and regional level, missions resorted to various forms of compulsion. And I have found cases of bishops going on tours and procuring Indian children to take as gifts to other dignitaries. So at a personal and regional level, the church was a part of this system. In Chile, for example, the church also certified that Indians were legally procured. In Chile had an exception because of the frontier wars in the 17th century, and so the church served the function of actually certifying that these were legal Indians, legally procured, and could be sold and bought. So the church was a part of the picture.
Yeah, interesting about Chile. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. We could talk also about the missions, but I'm gonna just respect. We have 3 more questions and 5 minutes. Andres, I don't want to abuse your time, and I also would like to hear like a few lines about your new book that you are very much involved with the galleys right now. So Peter Sapienza, like the university in Rome, what was the exposure of Europeans to slavery prior to the colonial period? Had there been slavery within Europe? This is something you address also in your book. Ellen Helford, are you aware that during the development of the Oklahoma Territory, that Native Americans who had been displaced from their homeland brought African slaves with them, and they were freed in Oklahoma and able to acquire land from from the Indians' land grant?
Right.
You have it also in the Q&A. I hope
Yeah.
I read it kind of correctly. It's dense in information, the question.
Okay. All right. Let me do very quickly. So first of all, yes, Europe. The institution of slavery was okay. So they moved. The institution of slavery existed in Europe. It was well established, and so some of the same standards apply to. And that's why Indian slavery initially became possible. So if you lived in the Iberian Peninsula or the Italian Peninsula, which were the two leading slaving regions in Europe, so to speak, you would find a variety of slaves pouring into these two regions. So there were peoples from the Eastern Mediterranean who were brought as slaves, as well as the so-called Wanches, the natives from the Canary Islands, and of course, slaves from Africa. And this was a well-established institution, and that's why when inhabitants from the Spanish Indies began arriving, it was seen as just another stream of humans that was added to what already existed before, and so it was not something new. Even from the American continent, we see it as very unique, but really, from the European point of view, it was something that had existed, and was just another part. Okay. About the Oklahoma, well, I haven't done any research on Oklahoma. That sounds really interesting. As I said, unfortunately, this topic is just so vast that we can go into the entire continent, into all the regions. But it is interesting. I will follow up on this.
You can see the last question, Andres, right? From Catherine Patterson. Do you see a connection between our discussion? Okay. And the genocide of Uyghurs in China and Rohingyas in Myanmar today?
Yeah, again, I would not. I don't know the particulars of the situation of China, so I would hesitate to draw any clear parallels. Even in the story that I'm telling, it's a case by case, and there were different shades. So one of the things that I want to avoid is to lumping everything together. So we need to be careful in how we look. So I would ask, if I were looking at the situation of China today, I would ask, are they taking them to a different place? Are they? So I would refer to these 4 characteristics that we talked about at the beginning to see whether this qualifies as something of the other slavery. But as I haven't really studied the situation, I don't want to jump into that and lump everything together.
What I would point to that point before you tell us about your book coming out very soon is that, I mean, it's a very difficult work that you have done. At the same time, at one time, making a very strong argument, because you're making a very strong argument about the existence of all these practices as, slavery, the other slavery, the slavery, but slavery nonetheless, right? And extrapolating conceptual lines in order to make the argument, while at the very same time pointing to complexities and tensions, right, in the practices. So it's a very difficult balance, but a balance that, I take, and I agree with that. We have to bring to other situations, that we analyze. So this is an amazing contribution, and I thank you for that. I encourage everyone to read this book. There's so much we haven't covered that is juicy gossip as well, and interesting, stories. I want to invite everyone to come to the 2:30 discussion session that we have. And I would like to give Andres, an opportunity to tell us about his new book and any closing, comments that you want to make, and thanking you immensely for this illuminating conversation.
Quite the opposite. It has been my pleasure to be here and share some of these ideas. After 8 years of researching the other slavery and dealing with the depressing fact of human nature, I wanted to do something completely different, even though I remain involved in the other slavery in articles and other ways and conferences, etc. But I wanted to move into a different story, also unfolding in the 16th century, also fairly unknown, but very significant for the history of the world, and that is the Columbian moment, so to speak, in the Pacific. Yes, the Polynesians island hopped from China all the way to the coast of the Americas, as we learned last summer. Exciting new DNA information saying that Polynesians really came in contact with Native Americans. And yes, Magellan was the first to sail in the opposite direction in the course of his circumnavigation voyage of 1519, 1521, and crossing the Pacific in one swoop for the first time in recorded history. But really the first time in which Europeans were able to go from the Americas to Asia and back occurred in a very obscure but extremely exciting expedition, which is the subject of conquering the Pacific. So this took place in 1564, 65. And suffice it to say that rather than a white European, as it was common for the officers, the vast majority of the officers, the pilot who was able to discover these navigation was an Afro-Portuguese man named Lope Martin. And so it is a story about race in a very white environment, as well as a very exciting story of the sea, so to speak, and one that really paved the way for much of what we're experiencing today in the aftermath of that connection, making the Pacific this vast space of contact and exchange. Spaniards continue to go every year to Asia, and paved the way for what would happen in the 19th century when the United States would take over from the Spanish galleons and would establish connections with the Philippines and with Japan and China in the same way that the Spanish did it. And so that's where we find the world, where we find ourselves, in which a lot of what happens in China also has very strong reverberations into what happened in the New World. So that's in a nutshell what's in that next book.
What I love about your books is that, like, very involving geopolitics, but in a way that is not the regular way in which you understand actually or read about geopolitics, but woven into these like wonderful stories that make them very compelling and very enriching to read. So, Andres, I want to thank you very, very much for this conversation. It's been amazing. There are so many topics, that we still have to discuss. And I hope that people are going to join the discussion session in the afternoon. We can go, into more details about, the silver trade and these Portuguese slaver. Thank you so, so much. And we look forward to your next book.
Quite the opposite. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everybody for being a part of this venture. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.